So we have a couple more that we're going to talk about today. The next one is actually the competence and likability trade-off. How many of you have heard of the case study of Heidi and Howard? Handful of you. So one of the interesting things about this is when I actually looked at this case study and I started digging into some of the things behind it, I realized how often I had seen it in my own career. The case study, for those of you that aren't familiar, was a Harvard business study. And it was a true story. Heidi Roizen is actually a real person. She's an entrepreneur, very successful. They took her story and wrote it down, and they gave her story to one group of people, and they changed, as we've seen many times, all they did was change the name from Heidi Roizen to Howard Roizen, gave exactly the same story to a different group of people. And they asked them, how likable they were, what did they think of the story, what did they think of the person. When people were describing Howard, they described him as likable. He's the kind of guy that you want to work for. He's a leader. When they were asked to describe Heidi Roizen, they described her as selfish. She's in it for herself. She's a self-promoter, not the type of person that I would want to work with. Again, as with everything that we've talked about today, that was the only variable that was different. Was on one, it was Heidi Roizen, the real person. On the other, it was Howard Roizen, the fictitious person, and the results were very different. Which speaks to what the competence versus likability trade-off actually is. The findings are that when women face a trade-off between being seen as competent and being liked, that men don't. Women are supposed to be communal. They're supposed to be nice and submissive. And when they violate that expectation by being assertive, by standing up for themselves, by confidently expressing ideas, they face this trade-off between competence and likability that men don't. I can honestly say in my career, I'm pretty direct. I'm pretty confident. I have never once thought, I have to decide, am I going to show up as able or as likable? It had never occurred to me before. And then when I started thinking about this, I've seen this a lot because I'm expected to be that. I'm expected to be powerful or assertive or, not necessarily self-promotional, but in it for my success. That's not a bad thing for me to be. Action-oriented. This is a trade-off that I've never had to face before, but the more that I thought about it, the more I have seen the women that I've worked with in my career make this choice between being competent, being seen as competent and being liked. The impacts of this is pretty clear. Having to produce results and be liked makes it harder for women to get hired and promoted because they have to choose between the two. Harder to negotiate on their own behalf. I've heard examples of women saying, but I go out and I negotiate for Facebook all the time and I drive a pretty hard bargain. I'm not afraid to negotiate really hard on behalf of Facebook. That is not the same as negotiating really hard for my own salary if I'm a woman. I am being communal when I'm driving a hard bargain for my company because I am taking care of the company first. I am a part of that. It is not about me. Makes it harder to exhibit decisive leadership to drive results because, again, if I'm too decisive or if I take too much ownership of something, I am seen as being too much in it for myself and not in it for the team. It also makes it hard to avoid office housework. Who can tell me what office housework is?
It involves taking notes during meetings or making sure to follow up and send out things to everyone. Just stuff that you're crossing the T's, dotting the I's that no one else necessarily wants to do or volunteers to do.
Planning offsites. We like doing offsites. They're a great thing for the team. Now, in some cases, this is actually somebody's job description to do this stuff, which is one thing. That's not what I'm talking about. I actually, in teaching this class over the last several months, I had a senior female leader come up and say, I didn't realize it until after we went through this training, the number of times that I've shown up to a meeting and people have said, oh, thank goodness she's here. She's the one that takes the notes. Office housework is something, the interesting thing about this is that when we talk about how to actually counteract it, one of the things that you do to counteract this is to assign responsibilities equally, right? If somebody has to take the notes, if we don't have a designated person whose job it is to take notes, part of how we counteract this is to assign responsibilities. Why is it important to assign versus ask for volunteers?
I think just because of the stereotypes that exist, perhaps a woman might be more likely to offer to take notes than a man would.
This is what Maxine was talking about earlier with regards to stereotype threat, right? I am expected to be communal and warm, so if you provide me an opportunity to be communal and warm, I will do it. The interesting thing is, what happens if a woman says, I don't want to take the notes? Somebody else do it. How do we describe that behavior?
She's not being a team player.
Yeah. She's violating that expectation that we have that she's going to be communal. Whereas if a man volunteers to take the notes, what do? High five him. Oh, you're awesome. Thanks for doing that. Because we don't expect him to be communal and warm. And when he does, we disproportionately reward him for doing it. Counteracting this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I think counteracting this is something that is within all of our power to do. Pushing back on that likability penalty. When you hear words to describe behavior like aggressive, pushy, how many women in the room have ever, if you're comfortable admitting it, been called aggressive at work? How many men in the room have been called aggressive at work? A couple of you. Now, this is interesting. That doesn't mean that it's not possible for a woman to be too aggressive at work. It is possible. But more likely, behavior that is not described as aggressive in men will be described as aggressive in women. And the best thing that you can do to push out so that you know for sure, is this aggressive behavior or is it not, is to ask for specifics. When you see things like style talked about in performance feedback or in interview feedback, be very specific. What does that mean? What specifically about the person's behavior either was or wasn't appreciated? As we've talked about all along, taking care and recognizing accomplishments, making sure that you're giving credit where credit is due, and like I said earlier, rotating housework, not asking for volunteers. It's saying, we have this meeting every week, there's 5 people on the team. Every 5th week, we're all going to take notes, and not asking for volunteers.